Good evening, everyone. My name is Yochai Ben Gedalia, and I'm the director of the Central Archives for the History of the Jewish People at the National Library of Israel. We are very happy to host tonight Professor Lisa Moses Leff, um, which is a professor at the American University in Washington and also serves as the director of the Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. If it was a real academic event, I should have present her through listing all her endless research and awards that she got over her career. But since we are in the library, I thought it will be more suitable to present Lisa through her books. So if we are talking about academic books, usually there's the first book and the second book. So the first book is more obvious. You write a dissertation, and after a few years, you get the first book. But the second book is like a second album by rock artists. Everyone is expecting you to reinvent yourself. But in a sense, you're still in the first book, in the first album. So the story, as far as I understand, of Lisa's second book, which is the topic of her talk today, is a search. It's not only a research, but also a search. Because while Lisa was writing her first book about sacred bonds of solidarity, the emergence of Jewish internationalism in France at the 19th century, using lots of archival sources, she looked around and she saw that the, all the important researchers all the important historians of French Jewry in her generation, in the generations above her, all of them are situated or studied in North America, not in France, not in Israel. And then she looked around and she said, it's not only the historians, it's the historians need something to work with. And most of the important sources, the archival sources for the history of French Jewry is not only in France and it's not almost not in Israel. Most of it is in North America. And then she tried to understand why. And her second book that we will hear about much today is based on this research, which is also a search to understand her work and her colleagues' work, why they have such an access to so many archival sources in North America. So it's a work about a cultural property, immigration of cultural property, but it's not written by a researcher who focused on that issue usually, but by an historian who is more interested in the sources themselves. So, and that's very unique and important in this work. I think that's one of the reasons that this book received so many awards, including the Sami Wu Prize for for the best book in Jewish studies. So I have the honor to ask Lisa to start her lecture. Shalom, Lisa.
Shalom, Yochai. Thank you for the warm introduction. And it's such an honor to be here virtually with all of you. We know that this is such a difficult time for libraries and cultural institutions. This is true in the United States as much as in Israel. And I hope that in these difficult times, it's so amazing to see so many people turn out. And I think it shows how much we in the Jewish world and beyond care about our cultural institutions. And I hope that what I am talking to you about today or tonight, it gives you some hope that even in these dark times, there have been dark times before for libraries, and that Jewish people have managed to continue to sustain them because they have meant so much for our culture and for our sense of ourselves. So thank you. I'm so glad to be here. Yochai, you gave such a wonderful introduction talking about how I came to this as a historian using these sources. There's more to say about that, so maybe that's where I'll begin. I'd like to share my screen so I can show you some slides. Is this coming now? Can you guys see? Those of you who have screens, can you nod if you can see it?
Absolutely, just enlarge the presentation, exactly.
There we go. Okay, great, here we go. So as Yochai mentioned, I first became aware of the story that became The Archive Thief when I was doing research for another book. And it was simply the recognition that the sources that we use to tell the story of the history of Jews in 19th and 20th century France, many of these sources are simply not where you would expect them to be. You would expect them to be in France, in the institutions where they were created, or the institutions that first collected them, state archives or private Jewish archives. When I went to those institutions to do the research on my first book on Jews in 19th century France, I found so many things were missing. When I looked in the bibliographies of books that were written in the topic, I saw that many of these sources were actually in the United States and a few in Israel. I was confused and I asked around, and it didn't take long to learn from other scholars or from archivists that the reason so much stuff was not where you would expect was that it had been stolen by another historian who had come before me, a prominent Jewish historian named Tchaikovsky. Let's see. Advance this. Here he is. This is a picture of Zoza Tchaikovsky at the height of his career in the early 1950s. Tchaikovsky, I learned, stole widely in the French archives. He stole in private collections of synagogues, Jewish institutions, and he also stole in public collections, regional archives, other kinds of state archives. He packed this material up and brought it back with him to where he was living in New York. And then over time, he sold these documents piecemeal, bit by bit, to various Jewish research collections in the United States and to some degree in Israel. His story ended in tragedy. He eventually got caught stealing rare pamphlets from the New York Public Library just down the street from his own home in New York. In the wake of that scandal, Tchaikovsky committed suicide. Now, I had already heard of Tchaikovsky before I ever knew he was an archive thief. And I'd heard of him for a very simple reason. You simply cannot do research in the field of French Jewish history without encountering the work of this man. He was the author of no less than 200 significant studies in the field, articles, and also books. He started publishing all the way back in the late 1930s. He published over the course of his life in 5 languages. And he started doing this at a time when practically no other scholar was working in this field in any language. Now, like most Jewish scholars of his generation, that is to say, scholars working on Jewish topics, he never held an academic post at any university. And yet, his studies, these articles he left behind, are still considered indispensable today. Any student who wants to go deeper into this field has to use his work. They're still really important. And in many ways, we can consider him a founding father of the field of French Jewish history. And yet to me, all of this was so strange to learn that this historian, respected for his scholarship, that all of that work was built on a foundation of theft, right? The very documents that he was stealing became also the foundation for that scholarship. So my research really began as a kind of curiosity, right? Wanting to get to the bottom of this question: why and how would a historian become an archive thief? And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that there was also an important question about libraries at the core of this study. And that's this: why would the libraries let this happen? Or in what way were libraries bound up in this? Because the more I thought about it, the more I realized that no matter how criminal, no matter how pathological Tchaikovsky's own motivations were, and I would just add parenthetically, they certainly were both of those things, Tchaikovsky would never have stolen so widely, so persistently over time, had he not had willing buyers, right? And the buyers for this stuff, as you're already, I hope, ascertaining, are these Jewish research libraries. Why are they involved? So it's a two-part story. It's a story about Tchaikovsky, this man, his motivations, but it's also a story about Jewish cultural institutions, primarily in the United States, but also to some degree in Israel, their involvement in this, in this theft. So let me sketch out for you what I discovered in my research. Tchaikovsky's story began in Paris in the 1930s, when as a young man, a young Zoza Tchaikovsky grew interested in Jewish history and Jewish archives. I should say something about his background, because it's really quite unusual that someone with this background would become a scholar, would make a career as a scholar. Tchaikovsky was born in Poland in 1911 in a town not far from Warsaw. His family was quite poor, and he eventually, in 1927, as a 16-year-old, followed some older brothers to Paris, where they, like many other poor Polish Jews, had decided to make a life, looking for a better life. Tchaikovsky himself was young when he went, right? 16 years old. He had dropped out of high school. He had very little formal education. And in fact, I found his report card from secondary school, where he had done, he was quite a mediocre student. He abandoned his education when he came to Paris. So all the more surprising that this man would become a scholar. But he was dedicated to intellectual life. So unlike many in his milieu who had gone into, the garment trades, working as, workers, and this is what his brothers were doing, he didn't do that. By the time he was ready for full-time employment, he had chosen a life as an intellectual, beginning as a journalist, writing for the Yiddish communist daily in Paris, the Naya Presse. By the late 1930s, so within a few years, he'd abandoned journalism as well, and also the Communist Party, and had moved over from being a workers' writer, a Yiddish communist writer, to being a scholar of Jewish history and the Jewish present as well. To what can we ascribe this change? This is a really important part of Tchaikovsky's story, and it has everything to do with a couple that he met in Paris who became mentors and friends to him and inspired him to become a historian who loved archives. These people were the Cherikovers, Elias Cherikover and his wife, Riva. The Cherikovers, like Tchaikovsky, were immigrants from Eastern Europe, And they were, well, Elias Cherkover, with the behind the scenes and often unattributed help of his wife, Riva, they were running the historical section of the Vilna-based institute, YIVO, the Yiddish Scientific Institute, which had been founded back in Vilna in 1925. At this time, YIVO was an institute based in Vilna, but which had sections run in different places following the migrations of some of their founders. So the Cherkovers had been in Paris since 1933. Tchaikovsky probably met them in the mid-1930s when he was working as a journalist. And what the Cherkovers were doing in Paris was breaking new ground by studying Jewish history on the basis of documents. And this came out of the spirit of YIVO in Eastern Europe and all that had animated it. For the Cherkovers, writing Jewish history, writing Jewish social science in a scientific way, that is to say on the basis of documents, was a passion that was deeply felt. And it had everything to do with their political, intellectual commitments, and especially their sense of what the Jewish people needed in modernity. For them, they had really been committed to this since the early 20th century. And for them, like for many in their milieu, this really was understood as a response to the challenges that Jews faced in modern times, right? What was going on around them in Eastern Europe? What they were seeing all around them was Jewish life profoundly changed. And this is long before the two world wars. This is really the opportunities that Jews had as they were beginning to move to big cities and leave behind traditional ways. The Cherkovers were not against this. They were modern people as well. But what they thought was that this meant that as Jews moved to cities like Warsaw and leave behind the smaller shtetl, their traditional ways would be lost. And as they faced anti-Semitism, poverty, the need to organize, they wouldn't have a tradition from which to draw. So to them, writing history and collecting archives was actually a very political and deeply felt response to this, right? Because they believed if Jews are to know how to respond to the challenges of modernity, what they need is a vast archive of their civilization, their knowledge, right? Religion had served this purpose in the past, but what they were seeing was the abandonment of those ways. And it's like this archive that they were building, and the study of that archive would allow Jews to know how to face the present and its challenges. And of course, these were challenging times. So in a way, to kind of sum up what I just said, building a Jewish archive and doing Jewish history for people like the Cherkovers and all of the YIVO folk was a commitment to Jewish nationalism. Building a Jewish nation required having a history that you did scientifically on the basis of documents. And that's a passion that they brought with them to Paris. But I want to add one more element that I think is really, really crucial. And that's that, the Cherkovers, like all Eastern European Jews, saw so many terrible times in the early 20th century, not least of which was the Russian Revolution and what it brought with it. So the Cherkovers were actually quite approving of the Russian Revolution when it began and all of the possibilities that it would bring. But like many Jews from the Ukraine region where they were based, were horrified to see the pogroms that broke out in the years following the revolution, the Ukrainian pogroms. They responded to these horrific and unprecedented crimes against Jews that took place during those pogroms with their own commitment to archiving, to capturing the evidence. And so they were part of teams that went out across Ukraine to gather evidence. And their hope here, right, it's related to the nationalism they already felt, that documentation is the way to understand the past and the present. But it was a little bit more than that. It had an even larger significance for them. And that was that they had a hope, which unfortunately turned out to be somewhat naive, that if the Soviet authorities were to see the evidence of these pogroms and to look at it closely and evaluate it, that the perpetrators of these unprecedented crimes against Jews would be held to account. So part of this was as if they were, journalists or investigators, part of gathering evidence for trials, right? And they're doing this on their own spontaneously. What they found, unfortunately, when they tried to present this evidence, disappointed them greatly. And they came to understand that there would not be justice for the victims of the Ukrainian pogroms in the Soviet Union. And instead they fled with their archives to Berlin. And through the 1920s, they spent their time in Berlin working through these documents that they had brought with them in the hopes that someday, somewhere, there would be a way to find justice. And it would be through publishing this evidence. And they had this plan for a Ukrainian pogrom series of documentary, like black books, that they were going to publish about these crimes. And they were going to make them available through publication for the world to see so that there would be justice. There too, their time in Berlin was cut short by anti-Semitism in 1933 when Hitler came to power. And it's at that point that they came to Paris, right? And I tell you all this backstory on the Cherekovers to really understand who these people are and what Jewish archives documenting the Jewish experience really meant in this world, right? It meant two things. It meant helping the Jewish people navigate the challenges, which were getting worse and worse. Nazism, persecution. They believe strongly that the way to fight is with the evidence. And they also thought, right, that this was for the whole world to see. And it was important, not just for Jews, but for the whole world to have organized archives of the Jewish people. And I think it's for this reason that Tchaikovsky, and I'm going to go back a slide, Tchaikovsky, who was, after all, when he met the Cherekovers, a committed communist who wanted to make the world a better place, but he was a Jewish communist who thought anti-Semitism was a problem that needed to be solved first. Tchaikovsky, when he met the Cherekovers, had a change of heart. And in a way, he converted. I think of this as a kind of conversion from communism to scholarship, right? But it's just a different solution to the same problem, which is how are the Jews going to confront modernity? The communists had offered one solution, and he, as he became disillusioned with that, saw in scholarship and in the collecting of archives what he thought was what was going to save the Jews in these terrible times. I mean, here in this picture, it's 1938, right? This is when they're doing their work, is with the rise of anti-Semitism and fascism all over Europe. And what these people are doing is they're meeting in the Cherekovers' apartment, and they're doing document-based studies of history. And it's not the kind of dispassionate work that I was trained in, where it's an intellectual exercise. It is looking for answers of the problems of the present by looking in the past, right? And using scientific methods. So this young man, with no real formal training, is training at the feet of this couple with the same passion that people were bringing to political parties, thinking of history and gathering the evidence as our best as Jews way to fight the anti-Semitism rising all around, and asking the right questions and using intellectual methods to come to good and useful answers. Tchaikovsky later said about this time in the late 1930s, working with the Cherikovers at their apartment as the most intellectually alive time of his life, because they had gathered around them all of these Yiddish-speaking refugees who were out there doing history, and the passion they brought to it was the passion of people just trying to solve the problems of the 30s, realizing that the inherited answers might not be the right ones, right? And they're looking to the past with their questions. Tchaikovsky was so excited about this in 1938 that he actually applied for a grant from YIVO to work full-time on a study. His proposed topic was he was going to spend a year under the mentorship of the Cherikovers studying the topic of the history of Polish Jewish immigrants in Paris in the 19th century. He got the scholarship, and he was going to have full-time support for a year working on a dissertation-like study about this. And it was supposed to start on September 1st, 1939. Instead, if you know anything about that date, it's the beginning of World War II. Instead, all those hopes had to be deferred, and the whole circle around the Cherikovers fled, dispersed to the four winds. The Cherikovers themselves went to New York. Many others went elsewhere or went into hiding and became part of the resistance. Tchaikovsky himself took a little bit longer, but he too eventually followed his mentors to New York, where they reunited under the umbrella of the YIVO new headquarters at the YIVO section based in New York, where they tried to resume, to the best they could in those conditions, their project of writing Jewish history on the basis of archives. But, Tchaikovsky was a young man, and Europe remained on his mind. And I think part of it is that when they left, this whole group and the Cherikovers themselves had to leave many of their precious archives behind in France. And I think that was very much on Tchaikovsky's mind, among other concerns, when in 1943, he signed up for the US Army, right? The US entered the war in 1941, and it was not long before many refugees, Tchaikovsky was not the only one, signed up for the US Army to return to Europe to fight the Nazis. Tchaikovsky served from 43 until after the end of the war. He was working as an interpreter, a translator, attached to the 82nd Airborne Division of the United States Army. This 82nd Airborne was a group of paratroopers. That is to say, their job was to jump out of airplanes. Tchaikovsky was with the 82nd Airborne when they jumped out of airplanes in advance of D-Day on June 6, 1944. And then together with the rest of his comrades in the 82nd Airborne, they fought their way across France through the rest of 1944. And his job was to serve as an interpreter. Here, his knowledge of French obviously was important, but Army authorities soon learned that the fact that Tchaikovsky was a native Yiddish speaker helped when they were interrogating Germans. And his knowledge of Polish, which had been the language of his schooling and the language of his town growing up, that also helped and somehow facilitated his ability to speak to Poles and Russians that they met along the way. He had discovered, and as did the American forces, that many members of the German army were in fact Soviet or Polish POWs. In this time, though, in Tchaikovsky's time off, right, sometimes soldiers have time away from the fighting. Here, his commitment to collecting was as strong as ever. In the time that he spent in France, Tchaikovsky spent a lot of time his own free time gathering documentation about what it was going on with the Jews under German occupation. So some of this documentation includes the beginnings of the papers of the French UGIF, which was the French organization created to represent Jewish organizations in France before the German occupiers. He also found rare underground periodicals that Jews or members of the resistance had created. And all of this stuff he gathered with that passion that he had learned from the Cherikovers, that this documentation matters. And he bundled it up and sent it off to YIVO in New York, where Riva Cherikover was at the archives. In the summer of 1945, Tchaikovsky got a new assignment and was moved to Berlin. So this is the aftermath of the war, after the surrender of the Germans, and Tchaikovsky was assigned to Allied Command. Allied Command had need of a man like Tchaikovsky who spoke so many languages, right? If you think about it, at Allied Command, you had the Russians, you had the Americans, you had the English, and you had the French. He spoke all of these languages, and he also could interact with Germans, though he hated doing so. He was miserable being in Berlin. He hated the Germans around him and found no outlet for that. Did not believe that the Allied armies were really committed to trying the crimes, right? Bringing justice to the Jewish people. He saw that there was a desire for justice for Nazi crimes against the Allies, but what he wasn't seeing at that time, what he felt very bitterly, was what the Nazis had done to the Jews. And so he took it upon himself to do something. And that's what I'm showing you here in this picture. So much of Tchaikovsky's time in Berlin was spent going on his own in his free time to the bombed out ruins of Nazi buildings. In places like the Nazi propaganda ministry, he spent hours sifting through the wreckage. I mean, look at what this place looks like. To find evidence, to find evidence. And he would haul it out, wrap it up, and send it to YIVO in New York, where I should say, incidentally, this stuff is still there and called the Berlin collection, right? So many papers, Nazi papers, actually wound up at YIVO because of Tchaikovsky. And he did it with a passion. Now, I should say, parenthetically, that while Tchaikovsky sent all of these documents through regular Army post office channels, I should say that the legality of what he's doing here is questionable at best, right? Allied forces had outlawed Nazi books. So if a serviceman like Tchaikovsky, was an ordinary enlisted soldier, he's not higher up, he's not doing this in any kind of authorized way. If someone like Tchaikovsky happened to find an anti-Semitic book, by regulation, what they were supposed to do was turn it over to their commander. And what for the most part was being done with Nazi stuff was destroying it. That was because the Allies were committed to denazification. They didn't want anti-Semitic books around in post-war Germany. So, this is archives here that we're looking at. It's not books, but if you think about it in that context, Tchaikovsky shouldn't be taking this on his own and mailing it to New York. Quite the opposite, right? I mean, in the most basic way, what he's doing, we could almost call it looting. And in the cases of other American soldiers who stole things of value, the American authorities were actually quite committed to stomping that out and prosecuting it, getting stuff back. I mean, we think about the case of the crown jewels of Hesse. The people who stole them were brought to justice. Why was Tchaikovsky? I mean, Tchaikovsky At the height of his time in Berlin, he was sending more than one package a day of documents and books to New York. Why was he allowed to do this when it's so obviously against the rules? And I would add one more thing, one more reason why, you know, he shouldn't have been doing this. Allied forces in Berlin at that time were preparing the case against the Nazis. They were preparing for the Nuremberg trials, for the international military tribunals that were to be held at Nuremberg. All of this stuff that Tchaikovsky is taking is stuff that can't be used. He's subtracting from that. Why would he do it? If we were all in a room together, I would try to call on people, but most of you are just black boxes, so I'll answer my own question. I feel like it's not hard to understand Tchaikovsky's motivations here, right? Knowing what the Cherkovers had taught him. They taught him that you can't trust the authorities and that Jews need to take matters into their own hands to document the crimes against them. Jews need to be able to study the evidence of what's happened to them in order to face the future. And maybe if somewhere there would ever be an opportunity to bring people to justice, you want to have the evidence. So it's that kind of thinking that went into Tchaikovsky's actions. And that's really borne out by what I saw from his letters from the time. That's what he's saying about what he's doing. A broader question, though, is, you know, we may understand why Tchaikovsky did it, but why did the Americans let him do it, right? And I'll say, I feel like pretty confident that the Americans let him do it because he was able to send it through official postal channels. No one ever went after him. And even the existence of a photograph like this means that someone was down there with him, helping him. And he writes in his letters about getting help from the army Jeep driver, you know, his comrades in the army, his fellow soldiers, helping him do this. The authorities not just turned a blind eye, but in some ways were facilitating this. Why? Given that it was contrary to their own regulations. To answer that question, we have to look into the context, because Tchaikovsky was not the only American Jew or not just American Jew, right? Because many people based in Palestine were doing this as well. He was not the only Jew in Berlin who was carrying out a salvage operation in Europe in 1945. In fact, there were many other such operations going on all over, and especially in occupied Germany. As I'm sure you already know, in 1945, when the Allied forces were making their way across Germany, liberating Germany, what they were finding was trove after trove of items looted from Jews. The most famous of these items are works of art. And we spent a lot of time in the 1990s figuring out restitution issues, right? I'm sure you heard about that history. But many other forms of Jewish cultural property were also looted and found in Germany by the Allied armies. There were about 3 million books that the Nazis had looted from Jewish libraries, private, small libraries, and large libraries, that they had looted across Europe, from France to Vilna, right? All over Europe. And it wasn't just books, it was also sacred objects. Torahs here we see. And as the Allies found this stuff, they were bringing it all together. And in 1945, when Tchaikovsky was doing what he was doing in Berlin, the Allies weren't exactly sure what they should do. The principle that they were operating under was that the things should be returned to the country of origin. So that is to say, if it could be found that these Jewish books that were found had come from Vilna, they should go back to Lithuania. If it turned out that they were from Paris, they should go back to France. For Jews based outside of Germany at this time, this was an outrageous proposition, especially when it came to Eastern Europe. The idea that the precious collections from Yivo itself in Vilna should go back to a Lithuania where there are no more Jews to take it seemed outrageous. Jewish groups based in New York felt strongly that these, what they were calling orphaned Jewish cultural property that had no, where the heirs had died, where the owners had died, should go to Jewish cultural institutions in the places where Jews lived. And in 1945, there was just a big fight over what should happen, while Jews based in New York or based in Palestine made arguments that they were the rightful heirs of this property. Eventually, here's where the books were gathered in Offenbach, Germany. In 1945, they're just sorting and thinking about what to do. But by 1947, an organization based in New York called Jewish Cultural Reconstruction that was headed up by the intellectuals Hannah Arendt and Salo Baron had convinced the US authorities that indeed Jewish things belonged not in their countries of origin, but in the new centers of Jewish population, the United States, eventually Palestine, and also to some extent in South America, Australia, South Africa, not in Europe. What they saw was that though there was a vast European cultural heritage, they believed, these intellectuals based in New York believed that the future of the Jewish people was not in Europe, was outside of Europe. And it's this idea that guided American authorities who turned a blind eye to what Tchaikovsky was doing, because they were sympathetic to this argument that Jewish organizations had that the law didn't quite reflect what was right, and that what was right was having this property in the hands of the Jews. And that's why Tchaikovsky was not just tolerated, but in the Jewish world back in New York, when all this stuff was coming in, celebrated for what he was doing, right? The law didn't map onto what was right, but in 1945, you went with what was right. He was hailed as a rescuer, and he was even written up in newspapers in New York as, a hero who rescued these Jewish treasures and evidence of what had happened to the Jews to be in Jewish institutions, available for Jewish people to study. Even though his actions were illegal, Tchaikovsky was seen as helping in the broader effort to rebuild Jewish life, just like many other Jewish intellectuals. The problem with Tchaikovsky is that then, after the war ended, and people like Hannah Arendt or Salo Baron or Gershom Scholem went back to their scholarly work, they were no longer carrying out these salvage operations. Tchaikovsky kept doing it. We know that through the 1950s, he returned frequently to Europe as a historian, looking for materials for his own work, and that while he was there, he visited synagogues, libraries, public archives all across France, which is his country that he studied. And all of this was to find evidence for his articles and books. In many of these institutions, it's really clear that he stole material. It's almost impossible to gauge the extent of what he stole, but we know that it was extensive. I've estimated it to be in the tens of thousands of documents. And we also know that he started soon after the war's end, probably from the time he first returned in 1947. Here, we cannot say that his motivation was the same as it had been in wartime. It wasn't that Jewish life had come to an end in France and we needed to have it in New York where Jews were rebuilding. Tchaikovsky could plainly see in front of him that French Jews, right, were really different than Lithuanian Jews. French Jews were numerous. French Jews had suffered terrible losses, but they were rebuilding. And they had lots of support in doing so. So while they faced challenges, French Jews were not willingly giving up their the material of their past to Tchaikovsky. This was theft in their institutions, and in many cases, very tragically, institutions like synagogues that had managed to preserve or hide their documents from the Nazis now found that they were being stolen from by a Jewish scholar. This is, the 1950s. One example of this dilemma is illustrative. As early as 1947, right after the war, the librarians at Paris's largest Jewish library, the Alliance Israélite Universelle, suspected Tchaikovsky as stealing already in 1947. But the condition of the library was so difficult at that time. They didn't even have enough staff to really know exactly what they had in their collection at that time. So they found themselves in a position where they didn't even have proof. They couldn't provide the police with proof that Tchaikovsky had stolen. So they had to use their personal networks and their friends in New York to help them try to get material back. Because they couldn't go through official channels, this meant that they could never accuse Tchaikovsky publicly. And while they got some material back by asking friends for help, what it meant was that they were never able to stop Tchaikovsky. And it would take until 1961, when he was caught red-handed in Strasbourg, for Tchaikovsky to stop coming to France and stealing, right? The thefts were not contained. The other reason why Tchaikovsky was able to keep going was that he found that research institutes in the United States were very willing to buy the material that he was bringing back from Europe. American Jewish institutions like the Jewish Theological, here's one document that you can find in New York at a really amazing Jewish library in New York, the Jewish Theological Seminary Library, that they purchased from Tchaikovsky. The Jewish Theological Seminary started buying documents from Tchaikovsky in 1950, and they continued doing so until 1978, when Tchaikovsky died. They weren't the only ones. Documents were also purchased by Hebrew Union College Library, by Yeshiva University Library, Harvard University Library's Judaica collection, and the New York Public Library. Brandeis University Library also bought from Tchaikovsky, and in Israel, the Central Archives for the History of the Jewish People. When you look all together at the evidence, it's clear that Tchaikovsky's motives had evolved by the 1950s when he was doing this. During the war, he was taking Jewish pages from Europe for ideological reasons, to rescue them. And now it seems pretty clear, especially as time went on, that he was doing it for money, to support himself as a scholar with no shot at a university job and only small jobs here and there. Seeking to support himself, he used these documents to make the money he needed to survive outside of universities. And of course, that money is only available where there were willing buyers. So I want to turn now to the final question. Why did they buy? The question about the libraries. Why would they collude in this? The libraries that purchased the largest collections from Tchaikovsky were the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York and the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. These are the two major Jewish seminaries that train rabbis in America. In the end, we're looking at tens of thousands of documents. When I asked myself why, I spent way too much time looking for like a letter where a librarian would say, here's why I did it. Those records don't exist. But what does exist, and this makes it really clear why, I'm showing you a few more documents here. It's really in the very mission of these institutions, explains why, which is that these libraries, these two libraries in particular, always had seen themselves as having the mission of building world-class collections to grow the prestige of their institutions, right? The best libraries in the world. They want to be on the level of Oxford, right? That level of a Judaica collection. That's true in general. But since the end of the war, there's a different tone to it that really shaped what they were doing, which is an understanding that with the end of European Jewish seminary life, right, with the end of Europe being the center of Jewish learning, that American institutions had to step up, that America could no longer see itself as the backwater of the Jewish world, that American Jewish libraries had to be equal to the task of containing the record of the Jewish people so that rabbis and Jewish leaders could take from this material enough information to carry on Jewish life. It was in their attempt to rescue the Jewish people, right? Their attempt to carry on in the wake of the Holocaust. That's their mission. And it's for this reason that acquisitions librarians in all of these places didn't really ask questions when someone approached them with precious evidence about the Jewish past, right? Librarians weren't naive. They knew what had happened in World War II. They knew the extent of Nazi looting. They knew how much had been destroyed and lost, and they were happy and more than willing to take stuff in as part of their mission to preserve Jewish life and help Jews rebuild. In a way, we can say it was because of this framework of rescue, right, that they become unwitting participants in Tchaikovsky's theft. A final point, which is about the effect that Tchaikovsky's sales and thefts have had on our understanding of the French Jewish past. I want to make sure you understand how Tchaikovsky sold this stuff. Tchaikovsky might have found things, this is from Alsace, he might have found them in one place, and then used them as evidence for his articles. After he was done with these documents, he would separate stuff that he found in the same place. And this, again, I would look at your faces if we were all together. This is something that historians and archivists find shocking, that he would separate things and sell one document to the Clow Library in Cincinnati and another document from the same collection to the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York. Maybe a third he would hold on to, or he would sell to the Central Archives of the History of the Jewish People in Israel. This is a violence to the basic archival principle of provenance. Provenance means we group things together by the institution or person that produced them. And when you separate documents, it's very hard to know what they are. I give you this example of a document separated from almost anything like it. When you look at it, very few people in the world can tell you what it is, because we don't know where or when it was produced. It certainly was not produced in Cincinnati. Why, if you're studying a certain topic, you would think to go to Cincinnati to look at a document produced in Strasbourg in the 18th or 19th century? In a sense, there's a violence in what he did. So while the librarians may have thought of themselves as rescuing, there's a violence here. And yet, it's not only violence, because it's more complicated than that. Once these materials were purchased by, say, Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, or the Central Archives in Jerusalem, or the Jewish Theological Seminary, or Brandeis, in a sense, they become accessible in a way that they hadn't been in France, because in fact, many of these documents stolen from private collections were not available to scholars in France. And in fact, the reason why, going back to the question, why are so many North Americans writing this history first? It's because these items were acquired by American institutions that we get the first academic, university-based studies of French Jewish history coming out of American institutions instead of French ones. So weirdly, problematic as this is, these thefts, and illegal and immoral as they were, they actually facilitate the creation of French Jewish history. And even back in France, it's actually in the aftermath of Tchaikovsky's thefts, and perhaps even in response to them, that those working in Jewish private institutions begin to catalog and take stock of what they have, both in order to protect them and make them available to researchers, that we finally get French Jewish archives. And it's on the basis of those that we get French Jewish history in France. So in a sense, and I'll end here with the paradox of my findings, Tchaikovsky's story is ambiguous. On the one hand, this is a story of theft. Although all these buyers thought they were rescuing Jewish history, they're colluding in a theft. And yet, even though Tchaikovsky's intentions were selfish and his actions were criminal, one effect of what he did was ultimately productive, laying the material as well as the intellectual foundations for French Jewish history. So it was not just Tchaikovsky's work as a scholar that made him a founding father of French Jewish history. It was also his work as an archive thief. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. There are a few questions. Stefan Paul asks if the Cherikovers are in the same historiography, as Borokov and Ringelbaum. Do you have any knowledge on that?
So we can put them broadly in, so these people have different political commitments, but they're part of the same kind of movement towards creating a modern Jewish history that has a very politicized undergirding. So if you've read especially about Ringelblum, this wonderful book, especially by Sam Cassow, Who Will Write Our History, you can really recognize what I'm talking about. And it's widely shared, and it's so influential on the development of modern Jewish history.
Thank you. Florinella Georgia, I think is the name. I'm sorry if I didn't pronounce it right. Asks, how could libraries legally buy these documents? And she adds, when you buy something, you must have records and money and accounting documents.
So that's an amazing thing that I thought too, that this was much more formal than it was. It really took a long time before these Jewish institutions were professionalized in their acquisitions. And in many cases, what they're doing is dealing directly with an individual. And this is not the only case in many of these institutions of kind of dealing directly with a dealer who says, like, I've got something that I found in Europe, and they really could just buy it. And in terms of their records, what's amazing is, every year they would publish these annual reports of their great acquisitions. And when you look in those reports, they never say who they bought it from. They just say the name of the donor who gave the money that allowed them to buy the collection. So when you go to these places, the stuff that's bought from Tchaikovsky will be called, like, I'm making up a name here, like the Goldberg collection, because Mr. Goldberg, and that's a name I'm making up, was the donor who gave the money that allowed the institution to buy it. And the identity of the seller is lost. So the only way that I knew that this stuff was from Tchaikovsky is Tchaikovsky used his name stamp on many of these documents. So you can see it's from Tchaikovsky. But yeah, this stuff was not regulated.
Thank you very much. Jeffrey Fine says, brilliant. How do I locate the book?
Oh, well, thank you so much. It's from Oxford University Press, or you can look on Amazon. It's called The Archive Thief.
Thank you. Amy asks, did he still have documents when he died? If so, what happened to them?
Yes, this is a great question, and one that many, many librarians and archivists in France also ask themselves. When, you know, these librarians in France who felt that they had been, and they rightly, that they had been robbed, really kept their eyes on this. And apparently when Tchaikovsky died, they wrote to everyone they knew in New York, what was in the apartment? You know, that was the question. What did he still have? The police actually investigated this because he had been caught red-handed stealing, and they apparently went to his apartment in the days after the final theft. And what they found was nothing. The rumors abounded that, I don't know how many of you know New York apartments, but often in the basement, if you have an apartment in a building, in the basement there's like a storage unit, you know, like a cage where you can put things. So there's always rumors that there was stuff in the storage unit in the basement. But when Tchaikovsky's widow died in 2012, when the apartment was sold, there was nothing. There was nothing left, only family papers. So my assumption is that before he died, he had sold everything. That he needed money so much at that point that there was nothing left.
Thank you. Jennifer from South Africa, thank you so much and for such an interesting topic and lecture. And I'm sorry, Noah is asking, similar to the art restitution movement, is there a widespread movement to have these documents returned to where they were stolen from?
I find this is a great question too. So when you talk to, again, archivists or librarians who work with Jewish collections in France, there's a lot of hard feeling about this. Hard feeling obviously towards Tchaikovsky, but also some hard feeling towards institutions that they know, you know, colluded in a certain way by buying it. At the same time, the real problem in the world of libraries and archives, and I can't stress this enough, is the lack of resources. Having this material is a great responsibility. It's a responsibility, very long-term responsibility, to take care of, store, make accessible, preserve, understand these documents that are in their possession. And all of the libraries in the Jewish world, I can't think of a single Jewish library right now that isn't struggling with resources. And so making that commitment, you know, there obviously is a symbolic weight of, you know, that makes French Jewish librarians say, of course we would want this stuff back. But then there's the very practical matter of where is this stuff best preserved? And I think that knowledge, of course, at a time in the world of librarians where people understand more and more that technological solutions might be the best way to deal with this, and that stuff should be in the safest place, the place that has the best chance of keeping it safe for the long term, but that using technology to make things available, at least scans of things available in many places, might be the best way to actually deal with it. So that's why there's not a restitution effort in the way that you would see with art. There's more of an effort to think about how we can share and how we can use technology so that all of these institutions can see these documents and we can have them in many contexts. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you so much. I put, there are a few more questions, but we're running out of time, so I'll let people ask them themselves. I am opening the microphones now. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful night and hope to see you soon in Israel and in our next events. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daron.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you.
Karen.
Thank you. It was wonderful.
Thank you so much.
Many, many thanks, Lisa.
Hi, Tamar.
Yeah, thank you. Very interesting. We enjoyed.
Very,
Thank
very
you very much.
fascinating. Thank you so
Learned
much.
a lot.
Thank you so much. You are awesome. Appreciate all your effort. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa, from Paris. Love your talk, and I'll buy the book.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's good to see your faces, those of you who are turning on.
There was a shout out from Nomi Bloom Wortman. Is she here? She wrote that she is. Sorry, I just have to find it so I don't misquote.
I can say it. I can say it.
Hi, sorry.
Say it.
I wrote at the beginning that I'm part of a Barnard Alumni Book Club in Jerusalem, and we read your book last year, and there were about 8 of us that were here from Jerusalem at your talk. It's very exciting for us to meet authors that we read, and it really feels very intimate. So thank you so much. And somebody else seconded it.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. It's one of the best that we heard the last few months. And you're from the library in Israel, are you? Excuse me. Are you from the Israeli library?
נאווה, אנחנו מהספרייה הלאומית והפרופסור מארצות הברית ממוזיאון לשואה.
אוקיי. ואיך אנחנו יכולים להגיע אליכם? אני רוצה לשמוע עוד הרצאות.
הלינק, שמתי אותו בצ'אט, אני אשים אותו שוב. פשוט תקליקי ואת יכולה להצטרף לדיבור שלנו, לראות את האירועים העתידיים באתר, וגם להצטרף אפילו לקבוצת וואטסאפ שמודיעה רבע שעה לפני כל אירוע.
אוי, זה נהדר. בדרך אגב, הדוד שלי, יצחק ארד, טולקה, אתם מכירים אותו? שמעתם עליו? הוא היה יושב ראש יד ושם, אבל לפני 20 שנה, הוא היה 20 שנה.
מאוד, מאוד כיף לשמוע. הלינק בצ'אט, תודה ולילה טוב.
לילה טוב ירושלים.
Bye bye. Toda Yochai. Thank you, Yochai, as well.